July 1944. A hedgerow in Normandy, somewhere south of the town of St. Lo. A young American rifleman, no older than 19, pushes through a gap in the thick bank of earth and roots and finds something lying in the grass. A German machine gun, an MG42, its barrel still warm, its bipod folded neat, a belt of ammunition coiled beside it like it had been set down by a careful hand. He cannot believe his luck. He has heard this gun. Everyone in his company has heard it. They have a name for the sound it makes, and the sound has kept them awake at night. It fires faster than anything the American Army owns. 1,200 rounds a minute. A noise like canvas tearing, like a chainsaw made of bullets. And here it is, abandoned, perfect, his. He scoops it up. He thinks he has just become the most dangerous man in his squad. He is dead in under a minute. Not from a German bullet, not from a sniper in the trees. He dies because somewhere down the line, a sergeant who survived 3 weeks in these hedgerows hears that sound, that specific tearing roar coming from the wrong direction, from behind the American line, and does exactly what he was trained to do. He opens fire on it, because in this war, that sound meant one thing and one thing only, and it did not mean friend. That is the story we are going to tell, and it begins with a sentence that should not make sense. American infantrymen, the men who fought their way from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, were told not to pick up German weapons. In some units, it was doctrine written on paper. In others, it was a hard lesson passed, mouth to mouth, corporal to private, a warning repeated until it became reflex. Do not touch it. Do not carry it. Do not fire it. Leave it where it lies. And here's what makes that order so strange. The German weapons were, in many cold and measurable ways, better. The German soldier carried the product of one of the most sophisticated arms industries the world had ever produced. The MG42 was so terrifying that the United States War Department made a training film for the specific purpose of calming soldiers down, of teaching them that the gun's monstrous sound was worse than its actual effect. Think about that. An enemy weapon so frightening that an army had to officially reassure its own men about a noise. By the last year of the war, German factories were turning out the world's first true assault rifle, the Sturmgewehr, a weapon so far ahead of its time that armies would spend the next half-century catching up to the idea. German optics, ground in the workshops of Carl Zeiss, were the finest on any battlefield. So we have a riddle. An American soldier in the middle of the deadliest war in history finds a weapon that is faster, in some cases more advanced, more precisely made than his own. And his own army tells him on pain of death, leave it alone. Why? The easy answer, the answer most people reach for, is that the order was about ammunition, that the calibers did not match, that a man with a German gun would run dry. And that is real, and we will get to it. But it is the smallest part of the truth. And if it were the whole story, this video would be 10 minutes long. The truth is layered. There were several reasons that American commanders forbade their men from carrying captured German arms, and they stacked one on top of the other, and each one was deadlier than the last. The first reason was a trap. The Germans had turned the act of retreat into a science, and a clean, undamaged weapon left lying in the open was very often not a gift at all. It was bait. The second reason was the one that killed our young riflemen in the hedgerow. The German weapons announced themselves. Their sound, their muzzle flash, their entire signature was wired into the nervous system of every American soldier as the signature of the enemy, and carrying one made you a target for your own friends. And the third reason, the deepest one, was about a system, because the American soldier was not really fighting with a rifle. He was fighting as one moving part inside a machine that stretched for miles behind him. And the moment he traded his own weapon for a German one, he tore himself loose from that machine. There is one man who is going to walk with us through all of this, a German engineer, a specialist in the cold craft of explosives and fortification, who would spend the war believing he understood the Americans. He did not. And the day he finally understood was the day he learned that some of the most dangerous things on a battlefield are the things that look like a gift. To understand what he learned, we have to start with the bait. Picture the cleanest weapon you have ever seen. Picture a German rifle, a carabiner, 98, lying across a windowsill in a shattered French farmhouse. No mud on it, no rust. The bolt oiled, the sling laid straight. It looks like someone polished it that morning and stepped out for a moment. To a tired, frightened American soldier crossing that room, it looks like the easiest decision in the world. It is the last decision some of them ever made, because the German army did not just leave weapons behind when it pulled back, it arranged them. And the man who arranged them was not a frontline rifleman. He was an engineer, a pioneer, a specialist trained in a discipline the Germans had refined for years: the cold craft of the booby trap, the spring foul, the explosive trap. And he understood something about human beings that no rifle could ever teach. He understood that a soldier who has been terrified for weeks will reach, almost without thinking, for anything that promises to make him stronger. So the German engineer gave him exactly that. He gave him the perfect weapon, and he wired it to kill. The mechanism was elegant, and it was simple, and that is what made it so terrible. The Germans had developed a family of pull, action, and pressure release igniters, small brass and steel devices no larger than a fountain pen. The pull igniter, the Zugzünder, fired when a wire was tugged. The release igniter, the Entlastungszünder, did the opposite. It fired the instant a weight was lifted off it. Read that again. It fired when you picked something up. So the engineer would take an undamaged machine gun, an MG42, the very prize every American secretly wanted, and he would set it down on the ground. Underneath it, hidden in the grass, he would place a charge with a release igniter, the firing pin held back by nothing but the weight of the gun itself. The gun was the safety. The moment a soldier lifted that beautiful weapon, the moment he felt the satisfying weight of it leave the earth, he armed the very thing that killed him. There were variations, and each one targeted a different reflex. A rifle propped in a corner with a tripwire running from its trigger guard to a grenade behind the wall, a pistol left on a table, its magazine taped to a charge so that pulling it free completed a circuit. An ammunition box, the kind a man would grab to resupply, with the lid wired to a detonator so that opening it, the most natural act on a battlefield, was the trigger. The engineer thought about the way men moved. He thought about what they would touch first, and he built his traps around that knowledge. The Americans had a name for what this did to them. They called it the fear of the gift. Allied engineers, the men whose job it was to clear these traps, reported with something close to professional dread how methodical the German work was. There was no improvisation in it, no panic, no rushed wiring. The traps were laid the way a watchmaker assembles a movement, each component placed with patience, the whole thing documented in German field manuals with diagrams and instructions. To the Americans, used to fighting, this was almost worse than being shot at. The enemy was not just trying to kill them in the moment. He was reaching forward in time, planting death in the ground and walking away, letting it wait for hours, for days, for whoever happened to reach down. And so a rule was born. and it was burned into every replacement who arrived at the front. Do not touch it, whatever it is, however badly you want it. If you did not put it there, leave it alone. A discarded helmet, a fallen camera, a bottle of wine on a table, a body that seemed too conveniently placed, and above all, a clean, working, abandoned weapon, all of it was suspect. The men learned to look at a perfect German rifle the way you would look at a coiled snake. The very perfection of it was the warning. Real weapons left behind in a real retreat were dropped, damaged, dirty, scattered. A weapon that looked cared for, that looked staged, that looked like a gift, was the one most likely to kill you. Now hold this in your mind, because it is the first answer to our question. The order not to pick up superior German weapons began here with the simplest and most chilling truth of all. The Germans wanted you to. They had engineered an entire trade around your desire for their better guns. They knew that the MG42 was the thing you craved most, and they used that craving as a hook. But the engineer who set these traps believed he was outwitting the American soldier. He believed he understood him completely, this farm boy who could not resist a prize. What he did not yet understand was that the Americans were not going to win this fight by being clever enough to spot every trap. They were going to win it by building something the engineer could not see at all. And the first piece of it was not a thing you touched. It was a sound. There is a noise that the men who survived the Second World War could still recognize 50 years later. Play it for a veteran in a quiet room in 1990, an old man with grandchildren and a garden, and watch his hands. The sound got into people. It bypassed the thinking part of the brain entirely and went straight to the part that says run. It was the sound of the MG42, and the Germans were proud of it. Most machine guns of the war fired somewhere between 400 and 600 rounds a minute. You could count the individual shots. Rat, rat, rat. The American Browning, the British Bren, all of them had that distinct separated rhythm. The MG42 did not. It fired at 1,200 rounds a minute, and at that speed, the human ear can no longer separate one shot from the next. They blur together into a single continuous tone, a deep ripping shriek that soldiers compared to tearing cloth, to a buzz saw, to linoleum being torn off a floor. The Germans called the gun by an affectionate name. The Allied troops who faced it called it Hitler's buzzsaw, and they did not say it affectionately. Here is the thing. The German engineers understood when they designed that rate of fire. A weapon does not only damage the body, it damages the mind. A gun that sounds like the end of the world is a gun that makes men freeze, that makes them press their faces into the dirt, that buys the precious seconds an attack needs. The terrifying sound was not a side effect. It was a feature. The American War Department took the threat so seriously that, as we said, they produced an entire training film to convince their own soldiers that the noise was worse than the gun. Think about how unusual that is. An army officially sitting its men down to say, "We know it sounds like death, but the bark is worse than the bite." Now follow what that does to our riddle. That sound, that unmistakable tearing roar, became wired into the nervous system of every single American soldier as one thing: the enemy. There was no friendly weapon that sounded remotely like it. Nothing in the American arsenal, nothing the British or the French carried, produced that continuous ripping tone. So when a soldier heard it, his body did not wait for orders. It did not pause to consider. It had been trained by weeks of terror to understand that tearing sound as a single word, and the word was German. So now put a captured MG42 in the hands of an American rifleman. Put it in the hands of our young man from the hedgerow, who scooped it up and thought he had become the most dangerous man in his squad. He turns it toward the enemy. He pulls the trigger, and he produces, with his own hands, the one sound on that entire battlefield that every friendly soldier within half a mile has been conditioned to fire at on sight. He has not picked up a weapon. He has picked up a signal. And the signal says, kill the man making this noise. It did not even require a mistake. It required the opposite of a mistake. It required every other American soldier to do exactly what he had been trained to do, to react correctly, instantly, without hesitation, to the sound of the enemy. The man with the captured gun was killed, not by error, but by the flawless functioning of his own side's instincts. His friends were not being careless. They were being good soldiers. That is what made it so deadly. You could not fix it with more discipline or more attention, because the thing killing you was discipline, was attention, aimed in your direction. And the sound was only the most obvious part of the signature. There was the muzzle flash, distinct in shape. There was the silhouette, the unmistakable profile of a German weapon against the skyline, the shape of a coal scuttle helmet, the outline a man learned to shoot at before his conscious mind had even finished forming the thought enemy. In the chaos of a firefight, in smoke and noise and fear, men did not fire at faces. They could not see faces. They fired at shapes and sounds, and every shape and sound that said German was a shape and sound that got fired at. So here's the second answer to our question, and it is crueler than the first. The Germans built the MG42 to be a weapon of terror, and it was. But that very terror, that unforgettable signature they engineered into it, turned it into a curse for anyone foolish enough to carry it on the wrong side. The Germans had made their gun so distinctive, so perfectly recognizable as theirs, that an American could not use it without painting a target on his own back. The bait could kill you when you picked it up. The sound could kill you when you fired it. But there was a third reason the order existed, and it was the deepest of all. Because even a weapon that was not booby-trapped, even a weapon used in perfect silence, still tore the American soldier loose from the one thing that was actually keeping him alive. And that thing had nothing to do with the gun in his hands. Let us do something the German engineer would have respected. Let us take the emotion out of it and look at the machine. Strip away the booby traps. Strip away the deadly sound. Imagine an American soldier picks up a German weapon that is perfectly clean, perfectly safe, and somehow makes no sound at all. He still should not keep it. And the reason is the one that cuts deepest into the heart of this whole story, because it is not about a single gun. It is about two entirely different ideas of how to win a war. The German idea was the masterpiece. The MG42 was a beautifully engineered weapon, but beauty in engineering has a price, and the price is appetite. That gun ate. At 1,200 rounds a minute, it devoured ammunition at a rate that emptied belts in seconds, which is wonderful when you have a supply chain feeding it, and a catastrophe when you are an American soldier behind enemy lines with only the rounds you stripped off a dead man. And the barrel. At that rate of fire, the barrel grew so hot it would warp and fail, so the Germans brilliantly designed it to be swapped out in combat. The gunner could change a glowing barrel in seconds, but to do that, he needed a spare barrel. He needed an asbestos glove. He needed the kit. And the American who found that gun lying in the grass had the gun and nothing else. No spare barrel, no glove, no tools. He had the masterpiece, and none of the things that made the masterpiece work. The Sturmgewehr, the assault rifle, the most advanced infantry weapon of the entire war, was the same story written even sharper. It was a marvel. It was also stamped, machined, and assembled to tolerances that demanded German ammunition, German magazines, and German armorers who knew its quirks. A man who picked one off the battlefield held a glimpse of the future in his hands, and not one spare part for it within 1,000 miles. When it jammed and complex weapons jam, there was no one to fix it and nothing to fix it with. It became what every captured weapon eventually became: dead weight. A heavy, useless club that a soldier carried until the moment he needed it most, and then it failed him, and then he had nothing. This is the trap that has nothing to do with explosives. The German weapon was an orphan the instant it changed hands. It was a single brilliant component severed from the vast and invisible body that kept it alive, and a brilliant component with no body is just scrap that happens to be shaped like a gun. Now look at what the American soldier put down to pick it up. The M1 Garand was not a masterpiece. No one ground its parts by hand in a quiet workshop. It was, by the standards of German craftsmanship, almost crude. And that was the entire point. It was rugged. It shrugged off mud and sand and the filth of the hedgerows that choked finer weapons. It was simple enough that a frightened 19-year-old could learn it, clean it, and clear a jam under fire. And behind it stood something the German engineer could not match, no matter how clever his designs, because the contest was never really between two guns. It was between a watchmaker's bench and a continent of assembly lines. The Americans did not try to build the best rifle in the world. They built a very good rifle, and then they built it more than 6 million times. The Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and the Winchester Repeating Arms Company poured them out by the millions, all identical, all interchangeable. And interchangeable is the word that wins wars. Apart from one Garand fit every other Garand. A soldier whose rifle broke did not lose his weapon. He pulled a working part from a damaged one, or he was handed a replacement off a truck, and he kept fighting. There were armorers in his battalion who knew the weapon cold. There were spare parts that arrived in crates. There was a barrel, a spring, a firing pin, an entire river of components flowing forward from factories 4,000 miles away to put a working rifle back in his hands within hours. That is the difference between a gift and a system. The German weapon gave you, for one fleeting moment, something better. The American weapon gave you something that would still be working tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, because behind it stood the most productive industrial machine in human history. The German engineer, the man who built his beautiful traps and admired his nation's beautiful guns, came from a culture that worshipped the perfect object, and there was honor in that. The objects were extraordinary. But an army does not fight with objects. It fights with chains, with the long, unbroken chain that runs from the factory floor to the man in the foxhole. And the Americans had built the strongest chain the world had ever seen. So, a soldier who picked up that perfect German gun was not trading up. He was trading a place in the strongest chain on earth for a single perfect link that led nowhere. And that chain, it turned out, did not end at the rifle. The rifle was only where it became visible. In the spring of 1945, somewhere in the Rhineland, a German engineer stood in a captured American supply depot and looked at something he could not explain. Rifles. Stacks of them. Crates of weapons, German weapons, the very arms that his side had carried and lost, gathered up by American salvage teams and left in neat rows. And the Americans had not taken them. They had not armed themselves with the finest guns Germany could produce. They had collected them the way you collect debris and walked away. The engineer had spent the war believing he understood these men, these farm boys who could not resist a prize, whose desire for a better weapon he had turned into a trade of explosive traps. And here was the proof, finally, that he had understood nothing. Why would an army refuse the better gun? By now, you know the answer is not one answer. It is three, and they stack. The first was the bait. The Germans had made the abandoned weapon a weapon in itself, and so the Americans learned to see the gift as the threat. The second was the sound. The Germans had engineered their guns to be so unmistakably theirs that an American could not fire one without becoming a target for his own side. And the third was the masterpiece, with no maintenance, the brilliant orphan severed from the supply chain that gave it life. But underneath all three sat one truth, and it is the truth this whole story has been building toward. The American soldier was never really fighting with the rifle in his hands. He was fighting as one part of a system, and the rifle was simply the part he could see. Look at what he actually was, that ordinary rifleman. He was one node in a squad where every man carried a self-loading weapon, where an automatic rifle anchored the firepower, and where, somewhere close behind him, a man with a radio could reach back across miles of farmland and pull down the fire of an entire artillery battalion onto a single point of ground in minutes. The soldier did not need to understand that system. Most of them never did. They were clerks from Ohio and farm boys from Nebraska and factory hands from Detroit, and they knew only what they could see. They knew that when they were hit and the radio man did his job, the world behind the enemy erupted and the firing stopped. Now you see why the captured German gun was the deepest danger of all. Not because it was bad, because it was foreign to the system. A man with a German weapon fired around his squad did not carry. He made a sound his side shot at. He held a tool no armorer could fix and no truck could resupply. He had unplugged himself from the machine that was keeping him alive and plugged himself into nothing. The order not to pick up superior German weapons was never about the weapons being inferior. It was about the soldier remaining part of something larger than himself, and the gun being the thread that, if you pulled it, unraveled the whole. This is what the German officers came to understand in the last months of the war, and they said so plainly to their interrogators. They had not been outfought man for man. Their soldiers were brave, their weapons were superb, their engineers were among the finest in the world. They had been outbuilt. They had met an enemy who did not try to win the contest of the single perfect object, because that enemy had quietly decided to win a different contest entirely, the contest of the chain, the system, the unbroken line from the factory floor to the foxhole. And in that contest, the masterpiece loses to the machine every time. It is worth saying clearly what this is and what it is not. This is not a claim about who truly won the war. The defeat of Germany was carried on many shoulders, and the enormous sacrifices of the Soviet Union and the other allies are not diminished by anything said here. This is a narrower and more specific story. It is the story of one technical problem, the problem of how to arm a citizen army and keep it armed across a continent, and of how the United States solved that problem so completely that the act of picking up the enemy's better gun became, of all things, a deadly mistake. That phrase deserves its full weight now. The mistake was never about grabbing a bad weapon. A soldier could spot a bad weapon. The mistake was about grabbing a good one, a great one, the best one on the field, and not understanding that its greatness was the trap. The bait killed you when you lifted it. The sound killed you when you fired it. And the system, The silent system you could not see abandoned you the moment you stepped outside it. The German engineer in that depot finally understood. The rifles were not left behind because they were poor. They were left behind because every one of them might have been a trap, because every one of them spoke with the enemy's voice, and because every one of them led nowhere. They were perfect, and they were useless. And that was the whole answer. The Americans never needed the better gun. They had already built something better than a gun.